It's helpful sometimes, this book does a good job of this, Ira Berlin, Generations of Slavery. It's helpful sometimes to look at slavery in sort of 3 periods. I don't like his word generations. I prefer period, but that we'll use his word because he wrote the book. So the charter generation, or the charter period, charter just meaning first, then the plantation generation, and then the revolutionary generation, the 3 major eras of slavery. And these eras are separated by 2 critical events that each changed the nature of slavery. First, Bacon's Rebellion, 1676, the decline of indentured servants and the massive upswing in importation of African slaves. And second, the American Revolution, which introduces the ideas of republicanism and sort of changes the way slavery is going to be fought and negotiated in colonies in the United States. So let's take these one at a time, these 3 generations. We'll start with the charter generation, the 60 years in which there just aren't a lot of slaves in the English colonies, but there are some. Slavery is limited. There's a sort of 2-class system: landowners and laborers, people who own land, who are wealthy, in many cases even nobles, and people who are indentured servants or African slaves. And indentured servants and African slaves in this early period viewed kind of similarly, just sort of a lower class based on their shared status of slavery. This did not mean that there was less brutality towards slaves during this early period, but what there was more protection. Slaves in many cases had certain basic legal rights. Laws were not necessarily designed only to favor whites. Laws gave a certain class of protections to landowners and a much smaller class of protections to laborers of any type. It also meant there was more social mobility for slaves. Not a lot. There was never a lot of social mobility in the English colonies, but a little bit. Let me tell you an extraordinary example of social mobility in the English colonies. Put writing. Anthony Johnson. Now, one thing I want to point out here, I usually ask the question on the exam, covering the period 1776 to 1865, and people want to write about Anthony Johnson because he's in this slavery lecture right before the Civil War. This is a guy who lived in the 1600s. He's very early compared to what we've just been talking about. It doesn't count in that time period. Anthony Johnson was captured as a free man in Angola, makes the Middle Passage, and he's sold in Jamestown under the name Antonio a Negro. That's what's listed on his bill of sale. Now, the guy who buys him, a guy named Bennett, a slave owner named Bennett, doesn't want to use him as a traditional slave. He doesn't want him to farm, fields of cotton or anything. What he does is he gives him his own field, has him build a house on that field, and then he basically treats him as like a European peasant. He says, farm this land yourself, live on your own, farm this land yourself, and I get some of the profits I get some of the crop when you're done farming it, and you can have the rest. So Johnson does that for a while. He gives some money to give some crops to his master, eats some of the food himself, and sells some of the food and saves up some money, and then he buys his freedom from his master. Now, the next thing Anthony Johnson wants to do, or I guess his name is Antonio at this time, what he wants to do is get some money of his own. So this is right after the starving time in Jamestown, and the Virginia Company has this ridiculous deal. People who are like extreme couponers, and they go look for these ridiculous deals that somebody missed that should never have been available. This is one of those ridiculous deals. The Virginia Company is so desperate to get new colonists that they say anyone who can get a new colonist to come to the New World voluntarily and settle in Jamestown, the person who recommend this apartment and you get $50 off your next month's rent. This is recommend Jamestown to a new colonist and you get 50 acres of land for free. That's a lot of land. and it's 50 acres of land per new colonist. So Anthony Johnson starts writing letters to people in England. He gets 5 new colonists to come over, and Virginia Company hands him 250 acres of free land. So now Anthony Johnson has a pretty big plantation of his own. He's one of the largest landowners in Jamestown. He goes out and buys a bunch of slaves and runs the plantation like any major slave owner in Jamestown. Now, his white neighbors are not happy about this. His white neighbors resent him. They'll go and kidnap his slaves or beat them, take his land and build buildings on it. And Johnson is very litigious. He goes to the court and sues these guys over and over again, and he wins. He has rights. He's a landowner. And in one of the court cases, he writes in his statement, "I know mine own ground, and I will work when I please and play when I please." Now, first of all, there's only one Anthony Johnson. This is a single instance. There's nobody else like this. There are other free blacks in the New World. Nobody has any status like Anthony Johnson. He's a unicorn. He doesn't exist. But even one of him would be impossible after 1676. This is only possible in the Charter generation because there aren't laws specifically discriminating against him because of his race. Once he's free, he's like any other free man. People are biased against him because of his race. He faces discrimination, but not legal discrimination. Now, after Bacon's Rebellion, indentured servitude declines. The English discover they can't trust white slaves, white indentured servants, and at the same time, Southern agriculture dramatically grows. There is a huge upswing in planting. Crops live longer. Cotton is introduced as a major crop. And so you begin to see the growth of large plantations. In the 1630s and 40s, Anthony Johnson's 250 acres was a large plantation. By the mid-1700s, a large plantation is over 1 million acres. Just massive, massive plantations. Giant plantation houses being built. Dramatic increase in slave numbers and a dramatic increase in crop production. And there is a shift in social structure. Instead of all laborers being the same sort of social class, there is a shift to this 3-class system: masters, poor whites, and slaves, where slaves are at the bottom specifically because of their race and because of their enslaved status. The American Revolution changes things again. The ideals of republicanism challenge slavery. In fact, while there are a lot of slave owners who signed the Declaration of Independence, there are also a lot of people who have severe qualms about slavery. Benjamin Franklin runs an anti-slavery society, even though he himself did own one slave. Thomas Jefferson, at various times in his life, resolves to free his slaves and then writes arguments about why it's okay to have slaves, but he's clearly tormented about it. George Washington ends up freeing some of his slaves. It's complicated. Basically, he marries into this incredibly rich slave-owning family, the Custis family. The assumption, the sort of unspoken assumption, is that George Washington does not really control his wife's slaves because his wife's family really controls them. And so when George Washington dies, he frees his slaves that he brought to the marriage. He does not free his wife's slaves. The idea is he doesn't feel that he has the right to do that, but if he really tried, could he have done it? Yeah, probably. But there's a lot of guys who are questioning this. What's more important, a lot of African Americans begin to try to adapt Republican ideals for themselves. Who should rule? The people with virtue. Who has rule? Who has virtue? Not the people enslaving us. Maybe we do. In 1776, Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, who the colonists hate, if you go to, anybody been to Colonial Williamsburg? It's a lot of fun. It's like an amusement park, only basically a colonial city with a lot of living history in it, but almost as fun as Disneyland, but not quite. And I'm a historian, so if I think it's not quite as fun, you might think it's even less fun. But it is fun. Also as expensive as Disneyland, too, which is kind of annoying. But anyway, you go there, and all the living history actors of the colonists will tell you how much they hate Lord Dunmore, because he's the royal governor of Virginia. He works for the king. Lord Dunmore, when the Revolution begins, this is what he's actually known for. That was how I first heard about him. I went to Colonial Williamsburg, and all these people were like, Lord Dunmore, bad. And then I learned what he actually did, and it was kind of cool. Lord Dunmore issued a proclamation in 1776, right after the Declaration of Independence is signed, declaring that any slaves who fought for England in the Revolution would be freed at the end of the war. He offers to free any slaves in America who want to fight for the king. Now, some African Americans do take him up on this. Thomas Peters, a black loyalist meaning fight for the king during the Revolution, and many others go to the British lines and take Dunmore up on this offer. Now, why don't all the slaves take Dunmore up on his offer? Why do most of them not go and fight for the British? Feel no loyalty to the British, but they don't feel any loyalty to the colonists either, who are enslaving them, right? So that's kind of a neutral argument, I would say. Why might they not go and fight for the British? Yeah.
Maybe something with, like, they feel like they might die. Like, they
Yeah.
have a better chance of living if they stay in slavery than they do if they fight.
So fighting in the army might cause them to die. What other ways might they die if they take him up on this proclamation? Might die of disease, not necessarily more likely in the British Army than anywhere else. Yeah.
Their masters.
Yeah, I mean, if you're in Georgia and Lord Dunmore says, "Come to Virginia and I will give you freedom," like, good luck getting to Virginia. That's like a 400-mile trip through slave territory. If anyone sees you, you're going to die. And the other thing that might happen is Lord Dunmore might not keep his promise. Or the British, Lord Dunmore might not be around anymore when the war is over, and they might not be able to keep their promise. Or somebody else might show up and not care about the promise. Now, I will say, to the credit of the British, they did, in fact, keep this promise. And so when they lost the war, they evacuated all of the slaves who had fought for them to Canada, and they freed them and let them live in Canada. In 1791, there's a massive slave revolt in Haiti. Haiti is a Caribbean island, part of the island of Hispaniola. It's a very bad slavery conditions there, owned by the French. The French. There's been a revolution in France, 1789. But the people who own France now in 1791 don't want to let Haiti go. They still see it as a colony. So the slaves in Haiti make up 90% of the population of Haiti, and they decide they're going to have their own revolution on Republican principles. And the French, basically, this is the terrible story of Haiti. The French decide that they will do anything rather than allow these slaves to have their own country in Haiti. So they send massive armies. Every French leader, the French government is turning over every year in France in the 1790s. Every French government sends massive armies to suppress the rebellion in Haiti, including Napoleon, who doesn't even care about the New World. He just gives half of it away to America for nothing. He sends armies to go suppress the slaves in Haiti, and 200,000 slaves die in this conflict, including their leader, Toussaint Louverture. Finally, in 1803, after 12 years of fighting, the slaves defeat the last French army and win their independence. And they then immediately go around, find all of the white Frenchmen who are still on the island. There's about 5,000 of them, and they string them all up. Now,